Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse.
Welcome back. Project 2025. You probably heard about it unless you've been living under a rock for the last 2 years. However, you may not know what's in it and whether you should care about it or not. And that's what we're going to talk about today with my guest, Stephanie Slade. Stephanie is a senior editor at Reason, the magazine of free minds and free market, a fellow in liberal studies at Acton Institute, and a media fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America. Stephanie wrote a really terrific article about Project 2025 in the October issue of Reason magazine called Project 2025 is No Match for MAGA Dysfunction. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks, Vero. Happy to be here.
So I'm going to start by asking you about you. How did you arrive where you are today and studying and writing on the stuff you're writing about?
Sure. So my background, I studied economics in college. I loved politics. I loved the idea of policy and politics and doing something that touched on those things. And I also loved to write, but I didn't have a journalism background. So I initially came to DC after college thinking I was going to work in politics as a political consultant or doing something involving actual, like working on campaigns or doing public policy work. And I tried a little bit of all those things, and I found that, in fact, I hated it. I did not like being a consultant. I did not like being a speechwriter. What I wanted to be able to do was write about the things that I care about. And so that prompted me to make a jump from consulting work into journalism. I was hired at Reason magazine almost exactly 10 years ago. I just had my 10th anniversary at Reason.
That's great.
Yeah. And I sort of worked my way up within Reason. I started out thinking I was going to be writing mostly about economic policy or politics because those were the things that my educational background and my previous work experience was in. But what I found when I got to Reason was that we had lots of people who could write about, let's say, negative unintended consequences from a high minimum wage, including you, Vero, we kind of had that beat covered. And so they didn't need people writing about economics as much as they had a need for people to be writing about religious liberty, religion, the intersection of religion and politics, that sort of thing. And since I am a person of faith, I'm Catholic, I jumped in on that beat writing about religious liberty issues. And then eventually that kind of evolved into my current beat where I track the conservative movement and all the debates within the conservative movement about where is it going and what should conservatives in America stand for? Is it individual liberty and limited government and free markets? Or is it this new nationalist, populist, big government conservatism that we've seen emerge in the last few years?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. I was thinking while you were talking about how you changed your beat at Reason, it's really something that is needed because, I don't want to generalize, but we libertarians usually, I guess the majority are not that inclined in thinking about religion or even the role of religion, even in civil society. And so it's something that we just don't cover very much. And I think there is a real need, and especially now, it's a good thing that we have some libertarian Catholic on our side, considering the rise of the integralists and at the very least, kind of the intellectuals who are thinking that it's good to use the government to impose moral standards. And so, yeah, no, it's a good thing, and you're very much needed for this. So let's dive into your article. So first, this has been one of the features that just been crazy about the 2024 campaign is how much it's not focused on policy at all, and yet, the Project 2025 has been at the center of a lot of attacks from the left on Trump. So tell us, what is Project 2025 and how did it get started?
Yeah, so I agree with you that it's fascinating. I was not expecting this policy document to get nearly as much attention in the mainstream media and become a sort of talking point, even among regular voters will come up to me and be like, hey, what do you think about this Project 2025 2025 thing. Like they've heard about it. This is like actually a marketing coup. I think there will be textbooks written someday about how the Democratic Party operatives managed to inject this policy document into the conversation and get it to sort of trickle down and be such a, like regular voters have heard of it. That's not normally how it works. And the important thing to realize here is that this is not the first year that this thing has happened. Think tanks like the Heritage Foundation have been putting out giant policy agendas before every presidential election for decades. Both the left and the right do this, right? They put out an agenda or a set of policy proposals that they hope that a future president from sort of their side of the aisle will adopt, and will give that president on day one, a starting point for what are they going to try to do during the administration. So Heritage Foundation has been doing this going all the way back to Reagan. They put out a big ginormous policy document with all the plans and proposals.
And it was called Mandate for Leadership, right?
Yes. Mandate for Leadership is the name of the book. Project 2025, they expanded this project somewhat so that it was not just the policy agenda, but also a personnel database, an opportunity for the Heritage Foundation and for other conservative groups to collect the resumes of potential people who wanted to go in and staff a future Republican administration. And so this way, again, the idea was that if Trump gets elected on day one, he'll have a whole database full of people that he can go to hire to fill out his administration. And the reason that they expanded from just being the Mandate for Leadership policy agenda into this larger Project 2025 thing that has such a focus on personnel, finding good people, so to speak, is because the conventional wisdom says that Trump during his first term in office was very ineffective, not because, according to conservatives, not because he had bad ideas or wasn't a good leader, but because he didn't have the right staff around him. That when he was staffing his administration the first time, he didn't think he was going to win in the first place, so he hadn't bothered to go out and find good people. And so he had to just hire from within the normal DC Beltway establishment. And those were people who were not bought in. This is, again, the conventional wisdom, that these people were not bought into what Trump's vision was, the sort of MAGA vision. And so they stood in his way. They didn't implement it. And that was the problem. And so what these different conservatives groups have been saying is we want to make sure that doesn't happen again. If Trump gets reelected, they want to have people who are true believing Trump loyalists ready to go to staff his administration. That was the idea behind Project 2025.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. This is, again, it's just really stunning the number of people who actually know about Project 2025. And I know that they don't know what really is in it because, like, for instance, like all my girlfriends, right? They talk about Project 2025 all the time, but they actually don't know I have a chapter in the Mandate for Leadership. And so that tells me that they actually don't know that they haven't actually ever picked up the book and looked at it. And that's the thing that kind of like it leads to all of these misconceptions about it. I mean, there's a lot of things we don't like about it, but the bulk of it is actually quite standard libertarian, conservative agenda, right?
That's right. So yeah, the first thing to realize is that this is like a 900-page document. So almost nobody who talks about it, including the people, again, the Democratic political operatives who are turning this into the boogeyman, they haven't read it. They don't know what's in it. And much of what's said about it is just completely made up or is extrapolated from maybe a few lines in the introduction of the document from the Heritage Foundation president, Kevin Roberts, who has a tendency to use more extreme language. But then when you go and you flip to the actual policy chapters, they're pretty, for the most part, pretty standard. I would say they're more hostile to immigration than maybe some previous, iterations of this book would have been. And there's a more mixed take on things like free trade, because right now the conservative movement is divided on free trade. The more MAGA Trumpy types are more hostile or skeptical of the idea of trade, more in favor of protectionism and tariffs and that sort of thing. But then there are still folks, that are part of the broad right of center policy coalition like you, who are pro-trade. And so the document reflects both those positions on a lot of things.
And in fact, this is one of the bizarre thing about this project. It's like, so my chapter was about abolishing the Export-Import Bank. And the way they approached me is that they said they came to a consensus. They had originally 30 organizations, like your kind of run-of-the-mill or conservative libertarian organization. They came to a consensus about what chapters to write and who the authors would be. what was really weird is like, I mean, I wrote this section, and then what I did not realize is that it would have a response. My section, which is basically, I'm kind of the libertarian version of the position. And then there's someone who, I never read her chapter or was even asked to respond, then wrote the opposite about why we needed the Export-Import Bank, which is like really bizarre. It tells you how much the ground has shifted. And I know that Ken Lastman at CEI has a chapter on free trade, and he too has a response. And so you can really kind of actually look through the book about the issues that are the most divisive, because usually they get a response.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and so it's hard to sort of paint with broad brushstrokes when people are saying to me like, well, what should I think about Project 2025? Should I be worried? And it's like, well, on the one hand, we do see the emergence of these, whereas there was once maybe a consensus among conservatives and libertarians about free trade and free markets being good and big government being bad. Now there's a sort of divide, or there's internal disagreement within the movement, and that's reflected in this document. And then on the other hand, there's like some other things where you hear people, especially on the left, saying, "Oh, they want to pass a nationwide abortion ban, or they want to outlaw." They should at least imply that Project 2025 would outlaw birth control, right? This stuff is not in the document at all. It's just scare tactics. So it's hard to say like, well, how worried should you be? What you've heard is probably partially true and partially completely imaginary, just somebody trying to scare you. But then again, from a free market perspective, from a limited government perspective, there is good reason to be at least not thrilled about the direction that this document suggests the movement is moving in.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, one of the things I can tell you from my experience participating in this document is like, when they approached me, there was no sense at all, from my perspective, that it wasn't going to be a kind of your usual type thing. I certainly didn't know there'd be a response to my chapter. And I thought, I even remember thinking, I kind of did wonder whether I should participate. And I went and asked, my boss here, and I said, should I? Because Heritage was already kind of like, not full on. It was back in 2022, but it was kind of already kind of like, strange. And the answer was like, would you write this for anyone? And I was just like, yeah. I mean, if the Biden campaign wanted me to write why we should abolish the Export-Import Bank, I'd be writing it. So that's why I'm participating. But I really I was left with a sense that it was not going to be something just weird at all. And I was thinking, wow, it's kind of nice. Like, I mean, Trump has been bad on the Export-Import Bank. He thinks we can use it to actually fight China, which, I made a point of actually explaining in my chapter why that's kind of not true. And I thought, oh, it's good. It means like Heritage, these groups are still thinking that export subsidies are bad. And then little did I know that it wasn't, the full story. But so, what are the chapters that you think are kind of like a reflection of the old school?
Well, it's generally pro deregulation. It's generally pro low taxes. It's in favor of. I described it in my article as a sort of drill baby drill approach, right? Like pro energy. Like we should be not hamstringing ourselves in terms of energy exploration. These are the kinds of things that you would expect the Republican Party or the conservative movement to have been in favor of 10, 15 years ago. And the mandate for leadership agenda still is generally on the same side on those. It really is, I think, immigration and trade where it's most obvious the shifts that have been made. And then the other thing is, again, the rhetoric, the general way in which certain conservative leaders, including, again, Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation, who oversaw this whole project. Maybe we'll be coming to talking more about Roberts and Heritage in a minute, but the type of rhetoric being used is much more militant and combative and angry and than what you would have maybe expected during the Reagan years, say. This idea that we are not just in this to put forward good policy, but rather we are willing to, we need to seize power, win power, seize power, acquire state power, and use that power, wield that power to destroy our enemies. And that we sort of reject the idea of the government as being a sort of neutral scorekeeper or referee that just ensures that the rules of the game are, adjudicates disputes and ensures that the rules of the game are fairly administered for all members of, the community. But rather, no, the government should be choosing sides, actively choosing winners and losers, and rewarding its friends, meaning conservatives, and punishing its enemies, meaning the left and possibly libertarians, depending on which conservative you're talking to. So this militant willingness to use the power of the state, wield it as a weapon, and have it not be neutral. I mean, that language is not at all what you would have expected from Heritage Foundation 15 years ago, and it is what you're hearing from leaders at places like Heritage today.
Yeah, and you have some good quotes in there. So this is from one staffer at Heritage who wrote about Project 2025, and it says the conservative movement increasingly knows what time it is in America. More and more of our politicians are willing to use the government to achieve our vision because the neutrality of keeping the government out of it will lose every time to the left vast power. And then Robert said, this is our moment to demand that our politicians use the power they have. This is the moment for us to demand of companies, whether they're Google or Facebook or Disney, that you listen to us rather than ram down our throats and into our families all the garbage that you've been pushing on us. It's our time to demand that you do what we say, and it's glorious.
Yes.
It's like, it's a very different tone. It's a very different approach from the things that they used to believe before.
Yeah.
And so let's talk a little bit about Heritage. What's happened? No, I'm serious because from my experience, right? In the past, I have worked with a lot of Heritage staff. There are still a lot of wonderful people there. Fewer than they used to be, for sure. And there are still like free market people there and people who are not populist. And it's not just that they're actually using libertarians as targets. Like supposedly we've been in power for so many years and the world is a reflection of the libertarian vision, but it's really changed. It's just amazing how things have changed. So what happened?
Yeah, that is a really big question that I was trying to answer with this article. So the purpose of the article initially was, okay, let's look at all these different groups that are preparing to staff the next potential Trump administration. Because again, the conventional wisdom said the reason Trump didn't get things done last time around was because he didn't have the right people in his administration, the staffers, the personnel. And so here are all these efforts by groups like Heritage to prepare to make sure that goes differently next time, if there is a next time. So that was what I was looking at with the article, but it became pretty clear right away that I was going to have to grapple with this question that you just asked, which is what the heck happened at the Heritage Foundation? Heritage Foundation was always a limited government free market institution. Now they're conservative, not libertarian, so they're not always going to agree with you or me on everything, but as a general matter, they want limited government. They believe in freedom. Freedom is a really important part of their mission statement, even still to this day. And yet something clearly has been going on since the advent of the Trump years. And it seems to have coincided with this guy, Kevin Roberts, coming into the top position in 2021. And so I started doing interviews with people who either previously worked at Heritage and have left or were pushed out or whatever, including some senior staffers, some more junior people. And what I heard from almost all of them was that over time, the Heritage Foundation went from being mostly a principled policy organization that had certain principles, free markets and individual liberty, limited government.
For a long time.
Yes. To being a more political entity. They actually launched about 12 years ago an explicitly political lobbying arm that's Heritage Action for America. And so they're much more interested in the outcomes, actual electoral outcomes. That is getting people they like elected to office, as opposed to saying we have principles or policies that we care about and we're going to work with both sides. We're going to work with whoever we have to work with in order to try to get good policies enacted. Now it's like, no, we want our friends to be in positions of power. It's more about the people and the power than it is about the principles and the policies. That's what I was hearing from folks. A lot of different people told me that same thing. And so over time, what that means is if you have somebody like Donald Trump, who is the standard bearer for your side, he is the leader of the Republican Party, and what you care about is keeping Republicans in power, you're going to defend him no matter what he does and no matter what he says. And even after an attempted coup, right, a refusal to accept the peaceful transfer of power, refusal to accept the outcome of an election, people at Heritage, at the high levels at Heritage, they wanted to stand by him because their point was to get the right people into power. And so this actually caused a lot of actual personnel turnover within Heritage Foundation, including the person who had been the previous president, Kay Cole James, leaving, and an executive vice president, Kim Holmes, also leaving after January 6, 2021, because I don't think that this is somewhat speculative, but I don't think that they wanted to defend Trump after that. And so Heritage went out and found a president who would defend Trump after that. And that was what we have seen, is increasingly a willingness to defend Donald Trump and his allies. People like Tucker Carlson is another example. No matter what they do, no matter what they say, no matter how completely insane, Tucker Carlson going to Russia and putting out pro-Putin propaganda videos, having a, anti-Semitic faux historian on his TV show. Heritage Foundation is happy to defend Tucker Carlson. He's there.
And in fact, Kevin Roberts went on tour.
Yes.
When there was a Tucker Carlson tour of sorts, and Roberts was one of the guests.
Yes.
And that was after he interviewed very positively really a kind of a Nazi apologist who was making the claim that Winston Churchill was really actually the problem.
The villain.
The villain in the Second World War. And so, it's quite striking what's happening. And but even the change within Heritage Action, because I have worked with Heritage Action in the past. We've worked, in fact, in I guess I would say 2015, I used to work a lot with Heritage Action in trying to get rid of their export-import bank, right? And at the time, people were complaining about Heritage Action because they were very combative, and sometimes it was seen by scholars as not really productive. And I will leave that for people to decide whether it was something to it or not. But when I worked with them, they were nothing but actually really free market people. And it's really the arrival of Trump that seems to have changed this. I haven't worked with them ever since, not intentionally, probably because they had no use for someone like me. And I was a little surprised when they called me to write about the Export-Import Bank. But at the time, and you cover this in your piece, there's another thing that's really misunderstood about the Project 2025 is that originally it started with a small number of organizations. It wasn't what it's become. And when they started adding organization, then it started becoming really problematic. And you mentioned a few organizations that ended up joining the program, the project, that were problematic. Can you talk a little bit about that? The Bull Moose Project and
right. Yeah. So the Bull Moose Project is one example of a series of, there's been this proliferation of new conservative groups in recent years that all sort of take on this more combative and pro-government, wielding the power of the state for our own ends kind of ethos. And so the Bull Moose Project is one. It specifically seems to be a relatively small number of mostly young men in DC, political consultant types, who started this thing called the Bull Moose Project. And they held an event, I guess it was 2 years ago now, called the Bull Moose Summit, that the Heritage Foundation was a sponsor for, and sent some people to be speakers at this event for activists. And it was raised well before this summit happened. It was raised by people online that these young men that had started the Bull Moose Project were training in ideas that were pretty noxious. So I think that there are plenty of examples of people associated with this group that would be, offensive. And I quote some of them in the piece. But in particular, there was like a guy, David Carlson was his name, I believe, different Carlson, not related as far as I know to Tucker Carlson. And he had used this phrase, blood and soil nationalism, in a positive way. He had said, this is the kind of nationalist that I am. I'm a blood and soil nationalist. He had also seemed to praise or suggest that his group and people on sort of his allies, people on his side, should be aligned with and positive towards this guy named Nick Fuentes, who is an out and out white supremacist. I mean, he's openly a white supremacist, Holocaust denier. I call him, I think, an anti-Semitic influencer in the piece, and he has a huge following on online. And so, but he's a known quantity. We know what he is, and so the fact that people associated with the Bull Moose Project were also choosing to be associated with Nick Fuentes is really telling. And then the fact that Heritage Foundation chose to be a sponsor of this organization, knowing all of that about the people who had founded this group, it just really tells you. I mean, some people say, "Oh, you're using guilt by association." Well, yeah. I mean, I'm pointing out that people have chosen to associate knowingly with people who traffic in anti-Semitic and other noxious ideas. One of the main, I was thinking about this earlier. The one of the things that I think really comes out with this switch in ethos, or this new ethos on the right among some of these groups, is that they really have bought into the idea, the sort of Carl Schmittian idea, that politics is all about the friend-enemy distinction. We have people who are on our side, they're our friends, and we will defend them no matter what they do or say.
Trump has said, I'm very simple. If you like me, I like you. If you don't like me, I don't like you.
Right. And so I think that's what you're saying. You're saying that these groups are willing to defend Trump or Carlson or Nick Fuentes, whoever it is, because they view them as being on our side. And so there's no enemies to our right. If you're on the right, you're our ally and we will defend you no matter what you do. And if you are on the left, or if you are not sufficiently, deferential to the views that we want you to take, then you are our enemy and we will oppose you and we'll treat you as an enemy. And we'll be willing again to use the power of the state to punish you. That is the real difference. I mean, to me, that's the most troubling. Yes, I don't like that they're waffling on free trade or waffling on the Export-Import Bank. I think that these are bad policies and they will make us poorer in the end. So I don't mean to minimize that. But ultimately, what I'm much more concerned about is this change in ethos, this change in the general orientation they take towards what is the proper role of state in society, and whether we treat our fellow citizens as fellow citizens who we might disagree with, but they're still our neighbor, our friend, our family member, our fellow citizen, or do we treat them as an enemy to be somehow destroyed by any means necessary? It's genuinely, I think, it's just a genuine change. And that's what I've seen at groups like the Heritage Foundation over the last few years. And so the way this ties back to the Project 2025 is the whole point, or at least a huge part of the purpose of Project 2025, was to find people with, quote unquote, the right ethos to staff the next Trump administration. So I say, if this is the ethos they're looking for, that makes me very, very nervous.
And so let's talk actually about the part of the project that you write about and that a lot of people have talked about, not as informed as you are, but have talked about, and that's the part about Schedule F. That's the part that a lot of people cite. Is the fact, apart from the mass deportation and the ban on abortion and all of that stuff, but like the part about basically coming in, firing all these bureaucrats and putting loyal members of the bureaucracy, wherever they're going to find those, loyal to President Trump. Can you talk about first what is the plan? What is Section F? Should we care about it?
Yeah, this is a really interesting and tricky issue, I found. And again, part of the reason I wanted to write this article was so that I could really explore it and talk to experts about it and try to wrap my own mind around how should we feel about Schedule F. So basically, in the waning days of the first Trump administration, he implemented a policy, again, called Schedule F, which basically was an attempt to say that of the more than 2 million people who work in the federal government, right now, to just give a little bit of overview, there are over 2 million federal workers. The vast majority of them are permanent bureaucrats. That means that they don't turn over from one administration to the next. They just work at the Department of Labor or the Department of Energy or wherever they work, and they do their job, and they're supposed to be non-political. A small number, about 4,000 people who work in the federal government, are political appointees, and they do change over from administration to administration. So a president comes in and he gets to appoint his own people who are political loyalists to head up those different agencies and oversee what the permanent bureaucracy is up to. That's the way it's supposed to work. It's a very, very small number, about 4,000. And so what I think is true is that when somebody like Trump comes in and wants to do a bunch of things that are totally outside the norms of what the way government has normally functioned, a lot of those permanent bureaucrats, those professionals who work in government, are not going to just get right in line and go along with whatever he wants to do. They're going to ask questions. They're maybe going to refuse to comply. They're maybe going to slow roll things. There was evidence of a lot of this happening where the permanent bureaucrats were just not going along with the things that the Trump appointees wanted them to do. And this, of course, was understandably infuriating to Donald Trump and his supporters, because this is where the whole, at least this is related to the idea of a deep state, comes from. So what they said was, we need to, instead of just having 4,000 people who are political appointees, we need to take a bunch more, like let's say up to 50,000 of those permanent bureaucrats, permanent civil service employees, and convert them into being political appointees so that we can get rid of the people we don't like and bring in people who are loyal to Trump and will actually implement the policies that he wants to put in place. This is the rationale behind the idea of Schedule F. Schedule F is a way of converting, again, up to about 50,000 of those 2 million employees from being civil service that are supposed to be non-political into political appointees that the president can fire the old people and bring in new people. That's the idea. So then the question is this a good thing or a bad thing? Should we be bothered by this? Should we be disturbed by this? People on the left are disturbed. They don't like the idea, right? But that doesn't mean that we necessarily should be disturbed by it. Maybe it's good policy. I think there is something to be said for the fact that if people are not, the president is elected, these civil service bureaucrats are not elected. They're supposed to do what their bosses tell them. That they're supposed to follow the instructions of those who are actually accountable through the political process, and that's the elected president. That's the idea. I don't know. I could see that argument, but I think there are a few arguments on the other side as well. One of the things I don't like about the Schedule F is that it is attempting to solve this problem entirely on the executive branch side. But these departments were created and the laws were passed and are supposed to be, policy is supposed to be made by the legislative branch. And so the legislative, that is the U.S. Congress, created the civil service. It created the laws that protect these employees so that they're not supposed to be fired just, at the whims of a president. The Congress wanted it to be this way. And so if it's not working out the way they thought it was going to, if for example, the civil service is not going along with what the president wants, and we think that that's a problem, then it really ought to be up to Congress to say, okay, we passed these laws. They didn't work out as intended. Let's pass new laws that fix the problem, as opposed to having the president come in through executive orders or, trying to change the rules in these sort of clever ways. And to root out the people that he considers to be bad apples or insufficiently loyal to him. There's just something about this that seems like it's not going about solving the problem the way that it's supposed to be. Under a rule of law, we follow the Constitution, and we don't just change the rules as we go along because we don't like the outcome. Like you gotta follow the process or the procedure to get to the right fixes. That's sort of, I think, the two sides of it is that the process side of it is this isn't maybe the right way to go about trying to solve the problem. And the flip side of it is a sort of political accountability argument that we actually should be troubled by the idea of civil servants who are not supposed to be political, who are refusing to go along with what a president wants because they don't like his politics. It suggests that they are political even though they're not supposed to be. So I think there are two sides of the Schedule F issue, and you can kind of argue them both. And I did spend some time talking about the two sides in the article. But then in the end, ultimately, I concluded that I don't actually think it matters that much where you come down, because the bigger problem with this whole Schedule F effort is Trump wasn't even able to fill those 4,000 positions last time around. He couldn't find enough people to fill those positions. He didn't have enough contacts in the policy space to fill those jobs. So what makes us think that we're going to be able to fill 50,000, that he's going to be able to fill 50,000 positions with people who are loyal to him?
You have a great 2 sentences actually in there where you say, but the solution to Trump's first problem, ensuring that the new staff is fully ideologically aligned with him, pulls against the solution to his second. He can have people who are true believers, or he can have people who are competent, but obviously not both. And and I think it really boils down to this, but this is what Heritage claimed it was doing by actually having a database of people that were supposedly both aligned in ways that we won't like, and but also true believers. So let's actually talk. Let's talk more about what this ideological alignment is, right? Because it is very clear that there's just a lot of people who would have qualified in the past for being in a Republican administration that just won't qualify this time around.
Yeah, it seems like what Trump and his campaign and organizations like Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 more broadly have all been saying is what matters more than anything else is personal loyalty to Donald Trump. We want people who are loyal to him and to his vision, his sort of MAGA vision, policy-wise. And so it doesn't matter if you've never held office or, if you've never worked in government before. It doesn't matter if you don't have a background in policy. That stuff is secondary. And in fact, it may even count against you because it suggests that you are a quote unquote swamp creature, right? You've been working in the DC swamp. And that's not what Trump wants. He wants people who are not loyal to principles or policies or other conservative organizations. He wants people who are loyal to him. So they want to go out and find these, true believing, loyal Trumpers, MAGA people, to fill these positions. But the thing is, when you stop and think about it, you realize that you may or may not be able to find those people who are willing to actually leave their homes, leave wherever they're from and come to Washington and serve in the administration. Maybe you can find enough people who are willing to do that, although I'm skeptical. But if you do, you're gonna end up with a whole bunch of people who actually don't know how to accomplish things, because government is a incredibly huge, complex organism, right? And so if you don't understand how it works, just being loyal to Trump doesn't mean you're going to be able to get things done. You're going to run into that problem of competence, of knowledge of how the system works. And so that it's just sort of a catch-22 that I think that these groups and the Trump administration find themselves in.
Yeah, and I don't know, Mark Calabria, right? He's at Cato, used to be in the Senate Finance Committee. I believe he was in the first Trump administration at HUD. He's a wonderful, wonderful guy. But one of the things, this is a guy who's been in and out of government, and one of the things that he said about the difficulty, and he's not the only one who said this, the difficulty of actually ending up as the head of an agency is that you spend really the first 2 years kind of navigating the agency with, especially if you're, in a difficult environment and with bureaucrats who don't necessarily want to help you. And so it's hard enough as it is, right? Even for people who've gone in and out of government, but not necessarily in this position, to figure things out. But so imagine if you had no policy, like no real, like really policy kind of knowledge, or you were just kind of knowing the issues superficially. But on top of that, or like the only basically skill you had was like you were loyal to President Trump, then it would bureaucrats would run circles around you, and you wouldn't be able to do anything.
That's right.
That's a really big problem with the vision, and just like having like 50,000 people. Yeah. And then there's an additional problem that has emerged, as we've known in the last few months, is that President Trump has distanced himself from Project 2025. And in fact, his campaign has said very explicitly that anyone who's participated in Project 2025 would never be selected to be in a Trump administration. So the pool of candidate is really, getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah, this was a sort of twist ending to the article, because as I was reporting it initially, in the beginning, Project 2025 and the Mandate for Leadership were released back in 2022 with a giant, release event and all this fanfare. And Trump seemed like he was on board. Many of his sort of former staffers, people who had worked in the first Trump administration, had been involved in Project 2025. Some of them were hired to full-time positions to work on that project within Heritage Foundation. There was every reason to believe, including because of things that Trump had explicitly said, that he was on board with the things that they were doing. And clearly Kevin Roberts and Heritage went all in on the assumption that the president would sort of have that they were on the same team, that they were all on the same team here. But over time, Trump and the Trump campaign turned viciously against heritage and this whole project. I mean, it was clear that they were very upset by the negative press. We started out by talking about what a great job the Democratic operatives did in getting all this negative press sort of built up around the name Project 2025. And Trump didn't like that. And he also, I think, we can guess that he did not like the idea that it created the perception that he was taking orders from Heritage Foundation or from some outside groups, as opposed to him being an independent guy with his own ideas. And so over time, you started having the Trump administration put out public statements where they sort of warned groups like Heritage to stop promoting their own policy agenda, to stop talking about their ideas for what the next administration should do or should be, because it was taking attention away from or credit away from Trump and the Trump campaign. And over time, more and more of these warnings started coming out until finally, right around the time that I was writing my big article over the summer, Trump actually came right out and said, I don't even know what this Project 2025 thing is all about. I think it sounds terrible. I have nothing to do with it. I don't even know who's behind it. So stop trying to act like it has anything to do with me. And it was a really big smackdown of Heritage and Project 2025 by the Republican nominee. Now, that hasn't stopped Democrats from continuing to do everything they can to try to tie Trump to the document and to the project.
And of course, it's fair. I think Trump probably, certainly, I'm sure he didn't read anything, but it is fair to kind of actually look to 2025 and certainly the chapters that are at odds with what the conservative and libertarian movement used to be, and certainly the conservative movement used to be about, and tied to Trump and to Vance for that matter. It's like, what's the connection with Vance? Because when you look at you don't talk about the chapter on labor, but the chapter on labor is also one that is just remarkably populist, and that to me. It screams, it screams Vance, it screams Trump. Trump is not so much about policies, he's more about some sort of vibes or something.
Yeah.
But so what's the connection with Vance?
I would say two things. One, I think that he is a really great example of this idea that they are putting loyalty to Trump above all else. So if you think about why Donald Trump had to choose a new running mate in the first place. He already was president and had a vice president once. Why is Pence not on the ticket this time around? Well, it's because he was considered to be insufficiently loyal on January 6th when Pence did not attempt to stand in the way of certification of Joe Biden's victory in the last election. Pence would not do what Trump wanted him to do and try to hold up those proceedings, keep Congress from certifying the election. He allowed it to go forward. And as a result, he was sort of cast into the outer darkness by Donald Trump. And this time around, he had to go out and find somebody who he believed would make a different choice if he was in that position next time. And J.D. Vance has said explicitly that if he were in that position, he would do what Pence was unwilling to do. So this idea that loyalty and willingness to do Trump's bidding, no matter the personal cost, no matter the sort of moral implications of that, was, I think, the number one consideration in terms of making that selection. Just as far as why did Trump decide to select J.D. Vance in the first place? So that's, I think, one thing that illustrates that point, that loyalty is now way more than anything else, the number one. It's not about, in the past, it was like, okay, well, he chose Pence because Pence had this long standing history in the evangelical Christian community. It could help win over voters. No, none of that matters anymore. In fact, nowadays, evangelical Christians are one of the demographic groups who are most likely to support Donald Trump. So they don't need Pence anymore. What they need is somebody who will do Trump's bidding.
It feels very despotic, right?
Yes.
It's just like, and in fact, Heritage loves Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Trump has actually said, and Vance too, very nice things about him, which is quite horrifying. and it feels, when you're talking, very problematic, just this new kind of like the thing that, that makes you in it or out of the new conservative movement.
Yeah. The other connection that's relevant for Vance is that he is friends with Kevin Roberts. Roberts was supposed to have a book that was supposed to come out like a month ago or something. And he ended up, after all this negative press around Project 2025 happened, he postponed publication of his book. But we already know that J.D. Vance had written the foreword. And in fact, I think the foreword had even been leaked. So we can read, you can find it online and read what very nice things that J.D. Vance had written about Kevin Roberts' book, and basically implying that the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, Kevin Roberts' vision and agenda are the things that the conservative movement should now stand for and should be the future of the movement and the party. And essentially it implies that he's bought into all of this. So it makes it hard now for Trump and Vance to try to put the distance they're trying to put between themselves and Heritage or Project 2025 when you have this personal connection. And by the way, I mean, it's not just Vance. There's also pictures that have been leaked of Trump and Kevin Roberts flying on a private jet together to an event, and the nice things that Trump has said about Heritage and vice versa. So there's many personal connections there that make it a little silly. It's pretty risible or laughable to think that anybody would believe that Trump doesn't know who's behind Project 2025 and isn't going to, in fact, do any of the things in this policy agenda, because many of his former staffers and close friends were involved with it. But he's at least trying to put that distance, because he senses, I mean, he's a very intuitive guy. He senses that there's a negative press, negative connotations now with those words, that term. And so he's trying to distance himself from it. This is what he does. When he sees that the people are somewhere, he moves to be where the people are. And so he's moving to disavow Heritage and Project 2025 and Kevin Roberts, despite whatever previous nice things he may have said about it. So this is, I think, the point that I make in the article is this is just yet one more reason to be somewhat skeptical that this idea of staffing the next Trump administration with true believing loyalists is actually going to work out the way supporters think it will. It's because Trump himself is not loyal to his own people. I mean, they're trying to be loyal to him. They're trying to set him up for success. But the moment he senses that it's in his political short-term best interest to throw Heritage under the bus, he did it. He didn't hesitate for a moment. So this is just, it's sort of, it shows that there's not really good, strong relationships here. There's not probably a good foundation for that you would need to have those relationships that would staff out an administration. And it's just sort of the chaos and dysfunction that follows Trump everywhere he goes.
Yeah. And just to actually wrap it all with a bow is the thing that is the most disturbing about Project 2025. The chapters that are the most disturbing are the ones that are really at odds with where the conservative movement was. Even on immigration, the conservative movement was never as extreme as the chapter on immigration is. And then there's trade, of course, there's the labor thing. But the thing that actually allows these move away from the traditional, more free markets, position of the conservative movement, who in these cases we're happy to have friends with us, libertarians, is precisely because we are in a situation where a lot of conservatives, they just don't assess the value of Trump based on these policy position. It's all about, are you with us or are you against us? And the irony of this whole thing is like, I mean, it is a movement, the new right movement, that is born out of anger against about the left and the excesses of the left. And yet, on economic issues, they just resemble the left in very, very striking ways. And that is only possible precisely because they have this distorted kind of understanding about loyalty. It's loyalty to a man. It's not loyalty to principles.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, it's really unsettling. So in the little time that we have, I want actually you to tell us you're writing a book. So can you tell us about the book?
Sure.
And why you're writing this book?
Yeah, so what I'm working on right now is a history of the idea of fusionism. And this is an idea that was very prominent in the mid-20th century conservative movement in America, but has kind of fallen off the radar, I think, of many people who work in conservative politics, even, let alone your rank and file Republican voter types. But fusionism was the idea that both liberty and virtue are necessary to human flourishing. And a good society must be both free and virtuous. It can't just be one or the other. That liberty and virtue are mutually reinforcing. And so if you try to accomplish one and sacrifice one to get the other, it's all going to collapse, because you just can't have a free society without virtuous people. And you also can't have a truly virtuous society if the people aren't free to make choices for themselves and sort of, exercise their moral muscles by making choices, true choices, which means having the right to make bad choices sometimes. So you have to have that freedom in order to have true virtue, and vice versa. That was the idea of, that really was an animating sort of foundational principle that underlies much of the institutional conservative movement. Many of the institutions, including like Heritage Foundation, as they were founded in the middle of the 20th century, was this idea, this commitment to liberty and virtue, and both of them being true. It's not necessarily true of all libertarian organizations. So I would say that to be a libertarian can be a fusionist. That would be somebody like me. I care a lot about virtue. Again, I'm a person of faith. I think virtue is really important. I think the whole point of having freedom is to then, ask the question, okay, what am I going to do with this freedom? I want to pursue a virtuous life. But I think that there are plenty of libertarians and libertarian organizations that sort of aren't focused on the virtue piece. And so they're less fusionist and more just pure libertarian. But I think the conservative movement in America, especially, less so in Europe, but here in this country, had been very deeply infused with this idea of fusionism. And it was almost became taken for granted. And so people stopped talking about it and thinking about it and defending these ideas and passing them down to the next generation. And so unfortunately, it's been really lost. And I think that's part of the reason that you now have the emergence of this big government power hungry conservatism, is that there has been a few things have been lost. One is there has the sense that, well, if people are choosing to use their freedom in ways we don't like, we're just going to forget about that freedom part and use state power to force them to be virtuous. That's part of it. And the other part is that there's been a loss of the realization, what I would say, that virtue requires of us that we respect other people's dignity and equal freedom and rights to make choices for themselves, as opposed to trying to exercise coercion against them, to force them to live the way we think that they should live. I think that to me, part of being virtuous is respecting other people in that way. So virtue requires freedom, but it's just been lost in this next, especially younger generation of conservatives, new right, again, nationalist, populist, post-liberal, whatever terms you choose to use. There's a bunch of different factions and people. It's a little bit messy, but there's just this idea of fusionism as liberty and virtue, being at the core and the sort of beating heart of conservatism in America, has been totally lost. And I'm trying to revive it by telling the story of how that idea emerged in the first place and explaining how our current politics have departed so far from that and why I think that's a mistake.
That's great. So when is the book coming out?
Unfortunately, it's still quite a ways away. I'll finish writing it next summer, and it will come out probably in the fall of 2026.
Well, good luck with the writing. And thank you so much for talking with me about this Project 2025. I hope that, people who listen to us have a better understanding about what it is, and keep up the good fight.
Thank you.
Really, I don't know if you watched the vice presidential debate, but I didn't watch it. But when I was reading about it the next day, I was thinking, just we're nowhere there. People who believe in free market and free markets and free mind and free markets, I was like, we're not represented on that stage. So
yeah. But fortunately, as a libertarian, I can say we are used to being out of power, so we at least are comfortable with sort of fighting from the sidelines and trying to just do our best without expecting that it's all going to turn out the way we want it to turn out in the near term.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.